The Scarlet came down off the walls of the state bedchamber at Halden Chase on the morning after Michaelmas, and half the household found some reason to be in that corridor to watch it happen, because there is a particular satisfaction in seeing a ruin confirmed with your own eyes. 2 footmen went up the ladders and lifted the rings off their hooks, and the great fall of cloth came down in slow folds the way a sail comes down. It had been the color of a hot coal when it went up at Whitsun. It came down the color of a dead leaf. Not evenly, which was the cruelty of it. Where the deep folds had lain against one another, the red was still there, sullen and true and beautiful. Where the sun had reached it, had gone a foxed brown, and along the topmost edge, where the light struck hardest, it had turned a pinkish gray, a bruised color with no name in any trade. The housekeeper had it carried out to the terrace and spread on the flags so that it could be looked at properly, and the whole of it looked at properly was worse than any part. 40 yards of ruin, laid out in the honest morning light with the parkland green and gold behind it and the rooks going over. The Duke stood over it for a while with his hands behind his back and said 9 words to his steward, "Then we are done with the Nether Halden dye house," and went in to breakfast. By noon everyone in the county knew, because the hangings were not the only trouble. At the last hunt of the season, the rain had come down at the second draw, and every mounted servant of Halden Chase had ridden home with the dye running out of his coat, scarlet crawling down the backs of white breeches, scarlet in the saddle leather, scarlet blooming through shirt linen in long pink tongues that no washing would take out. 3 of the men lost their good shirts. One lost his temper in the yard, in front of company, and said what he thought of Halden Red where the master could hear him. And Halden Red had a maker, and everybody knew her name. She was in the market at Marchbury when it reached her, standing by the wool stalls with her basket on her arm, a spare, straight-backed woman in a plain slate blue gown and a dyer's canvas apron, her fair hair pinned flat beneath a linen cap, and her hands stained red to the wrist. She heard it first as a shape, rather than as words, the way you hear your own name in a crowded hall, a stir at the far end of the row, a head turning, then another, then the peculiar hush that falls around a person when everyone in earshot has decided at once to look at her, and not to speak to her. A wool factor she had dealt with for 11 years took his hand off the sack he had been holding open for her and put it in his pocket. "I'm sorry, Miss Crail," he said. "I'll not be buying this quarter." She asked him, quite steadily, what had happened, and he told her, the hangings, the hunt, the shirts, and the word going round the cloth hall that the famous Halden Scarlet was a cheat, a soft red laid on thin and quick for people who would not find out until the sun found it out for them. Her name, he added, being an honest man and embarrassed, had been said aloud at the chase by the steward himself. She stood a moment. She did not raise her voice, then or at any time in the whole miserable business that followed, which the village would afterwards decide was either the strangest thing about her or the only thing about her. "I did not dye that cloth," she said. The factor looked away, over her shoulder, at the church tower, which is where men look when they have already made their arrangements. And there it was, complete, the entire ruin of a life's trade, delivered in a market row on a bright morning between the wool and the tallow. She walked the 4 miles home. She let herself into the dye house that her grandmother had held before her, and stood in the cold of it with the coppers dark, and the vats skinned over, and the racked hanks glowing on their rails, and she did not weep, because weeping would have taken time, and she had a thing to do while the light was good. She took the shears out of the drawer. She went to the one remaining end of the cloth she had truly dyed that spring, the last of her own work, and cut 2 strips the width of 2 fingers, and pinned them side by side on a stiff card. She wrote the day on it in her small upright hand, the morrow of Michaelmas, and beneath it the number of the batch and the well the water had come from. Then she folded a paper over the left-hand strip and pressed her grandmother's brass seal into the soft wax, so that half of that scarlet went into the dark and would stay there, and half was left bare to the light. She carried the card to the south window and pinned it in the row with all the others, hundreds of them, going back further than she could remember, and she set the shutter open so the sun could get at it. Her grandmother had said it to her 1,000 times over the steam. In the flat way she said everything, the cloth keeps its own account. You need not shout, you need only keep the card and let the year go by. So she kept the card, and she let the year go by, and she said nothing at all to anybody. And a long way off in Marchbury, in a fine new counting house with his name on the door, a merchant hung a length of his own famous scarlet in his own sunny window, to show the trade how well it held. To understand what was taken from Hester Crail, you have to understand what she had, and to understand what she had you have to go back a little, to the years before any of it went wrong, when the dye house at Nether Haldon was simply a low stone building at the bottom of the village, with steam coming out of its roof vents on cold mornings, and nobody thought about it at all except to say, when a stranger admired somebody's cloak, that the red came from down the lane. The building sat where it sat, for one reason, and the reason came out of the hillside behind it. The spring they called the Lady Well ran off the chalk, and it ran hard, so hard, that it furred the inside of a kettle white in a fortnight, and made the women of the village curse it every wash day. Hard water is a nuisance for laundry, and a nuisance for tea, and for madder red it is the difference between a colour and a miracle. The lime in that water went into the dye and set it and deepened it, and gave the reds out of that one building a body that reds out of soft water country simply do not have. Nobody in Nether Haldon could have explained the chemistry of it. Everyone in Nether Haldon knew that the water was why. The rest of it was Damaris Crail. Hester's grandmother had come to the dye house as a bride and buried 2 husbands out of it and run it alone for 30 years, and she was, by the time Hester was old enough to be useful, a small bent woman in a russet gown and a scorched apron, her forearms mottled madder red to the elbow. She was not a warm woman. She was a woman who had discovered exactly one thing in the world that would obey her if she was exact enough with it, and she had given her whole life to being exact enough. What she had made out of 40 years of being exact was a scarlet. It is worth being plain about how hard that is, because the age was full of reds, and most of them were lies. Any dyer with a copper and a bag of madder root can raise a red, and it will look very well the day it leaves the vat and much less well the following summer. Fastness, the refusal of a colour to leave, in sun and rain and soap, over years, is the whole art. And it is not in the dye. It is in the mordant, in the invisible business of persuading a metal salt to lock into the fibre so that the colour has something to hold to that will not let go. Damaris Crail's mordant took 11 days. It began with the wool steeped in a liquor of wheat bran and stale ale until it soured and stank so badly that the wind direction mattered to the whole village. Then alum, dissolved in the hard chalk water and never in rainwater, at a weight that had to be got right to the drachm. Then, and this was the part that no trained dyer in England would have done, the part that made journeymen laugh out loud when they heard it, the oak galls went in at the second bath, not the first. Every book of receipts in the trade puts the galls before the alum. Damaris put them after, because her grandmother had put them after, and the reason nobody could argue with was that her reds held and other reds did not. Then a spoonful, no more, of what the family called the grey liquor, a little pewter scrap dissolved down slow in acid to a clear metallic water, which brightened the red out of brick and into fire. And then, before the madder ever touched it, the wool went out onto the grass. The crofting green behind the dye house was 3/4 of an acre of nothing much, sloping south, and to a visitor it was simply where the washing went. To the trade it was the one part of the method that could not be hurried by any means known to man. The mordanted wool was spread on the grass 3 days and 3 nights, rain or no rain, turned twice a day, and whatever the sun and the dew did in those 3 days, the great chemists of the age could not have told her. The colour that went on afterwards went in rather than on. Crofted wool took the madder to the heart of the fibre and held it for a lifetime. Wool hurried straight to the vat came out looking exactly the same, and began, quietly and invisibly, to lose from the day it was made. That was the whole secret, and it was not much of a secret, and it could not be stolen, because the thing you had to steal was patience. All of it was written down. The book was a fat quarto in worn calf, so swollen with what had been pasted and tied into it that it would not shut flat, and it lived on the shelf above the drying rail where the heat kept the damp out of it. Every batch that had ever gone through the dye house was in it. In 2 hands, Damaris's cramped, blotted, furious one for the older half, and Hester's small upright one for the newer. Each entry gave the day by the feast it fell near, the weights, the well, the weather, the days on the grass, and any accident, and through a slit in the margin of every entry, tied in a neat reef knot, was a snip of the actual yarn. You could turn the pages and run your thumb down the years and feel the color change under it. There was one flaw in the book, and it mattered later more than anything else in this story, so it must be set down now. A long while before, a candle had gone over in the night onto the shelf, and the fire had been beaten out with a wet sack before it took hold, but the corner of one leaf had burned. The leaf was the master receipt, the page at the very front where Damaris had set down the proportions of the great Scarlet once and for all, and what the fire had eaten was the corner where the weight of oak galls was written. The rest of the page survived. The galls were gone, a brown scalloped hole with the ash edge still on it. Damaris had shrugged at it. She knew the number the way she knew her own name. And she told it to Hester over the vat perhaps 200 times, and Hester never wrote it back in. Partly because there was no room on the burnt leaf, and partly because there is a kind of person who feels that a thing carried in the head is safer than a thing left about on paper. So the book said everything about the Scarlet except one number, and the one number lived in one woman's memory, and neither of them ever thought about it again until the year everything went wrong. The cards were Hester's own addition, and they were the reason she is remembered. Damaris had tied her snips into the book and been satisfied. Hester, who had a tidier and colder mind than her grandmother and a longer view, began doing something else with them beside. From the year she first took a batch through the whole 11 days alone, she cut 2 strips from every finished piece and pinned them side by side on a stiff card, and wrote on the card the day by its feast, the batch, the weight, the well, and then she folded a paper hood over the left-hand strip and sealed the hood down with wax and pressed her grandmother's brass seal into it. Then she pinned the card on the boards under the south window and left it there. It took her a while to be able to say aloud why she did it, because it sounded, to her, like boasting. What she had built, without ever using the word, was an experiment that ran for years without her attention. The sealed strip lay in the dark and did not age. The bare strip stood in the light and aged as fast as any cloth in England. Every card was a color and its own ghost, side by side, and all you had to do to know what a die was worth was break the wax and hold the 2 together. Her own reds, opened after 5 years, matched. There would be the faintest softening at the very edge of the bare strip, no more than a breath, and under it the sealed strip would be exactly the same red, and you could put a thumb across the join and not find it. She had, by the time this story properly begins, more than 400 cards on those boards, oldest at the top, by the roof beam, and newest at her elbow. The whole south wall, going from deep old scarlets, through the madder rose reds, and then the blues. The pale sky of a 4th dip, and the near black of a 20th. Visitors thought it decoration. One gentleman from the county society had called it charming. And once a year, on Lady Day, she did one thing more, and she did it because Damaris had made her promise to. She cut a 3rd strip from the best red of the year, pinned it to a card, wrote the day on it, and carried it up the lane to the church, where the vicar wrote the day beneath her writing in his own hand and initialed it, and the 2 churchwardens set their names beside his, and then the card went into a paper, and the paper was sealed with the parish seal in the vestry in front of all 3 of them, and laid in the parish chest with the register and the terrier and the charity accounts. Damaris's reason had been an old woman's reason and a bitter one. There had been a business, long before, with a Marchbury house that had sold a cloth as Halden work and had it fail, and there had been no way on earth to prove the cloth was not hers. Put it where a churchwarden must sign for it, Damaris had said. Then it is not your word. Then it is the parish's word, and the parish does not care about you, which is exactly what makes it worth having. So there was a run of sealed cards in the chest under the tower, one for every Lady Day of Hester's working life, and a dozen of Damaris's before that, each carrying the year written in a hand that was not the Crayle's, and initialed by men who had no reason to lie for them. Nobody had opened one since the day it went in. Nobody had any occasion to. Damaris died in the hard frost, quickly and without much fuss, and Hester ran the dye house alone after that. She was 31 that spring, and she was, by then, a spare, straight-backed woman in a plain slate-blue gown and a dyer's canvas apron, her fair hair pinned flat beneath a linen cap, and her hands stained red to the wrist. The stain never came off. It faded to a rust in a slack week, and came back to crimson within a day of the vats, and she had long ago stopped wearing gloves to church about it. She was not disliked in Nether Halden, she was simply not thought about, which in a village is a different and safer condition. She spoke when she was spoken to, and was known to be exact in her weights and honest about a fault. Half the lane depended on her without ever putting it that way. Mrs. Bligh in the end cottage wove, 3 houses spun, Tobias Prine at the top of the lane fulled the cloth. The red was the reason. Plain broadcloth from Nether Halden was worth what plain broadcloth is worth anywhere. Halden Scarlet was worth sending for. And the dye house itself, the building and the crofting green, and the lady well that made the whole thing possible, belonged to the Chase. The Crails held it on a lease that Damaris had never bothered to look at, and Hester had read once, carefully, and disliked. It was a yearly tenancy at the will of the estate, renewable at Michaelmas, in the gift of whoever happened to be steward. It had been renewed without a word for so long that everybody had stopped thinking of it as a thing that could be refused. The old Duke had been an absent, amiable, gouty man who had let his estate run itself for 20 years, and when he died the title went to his nephew, and the nephew came home from 6 years abroad to find a great house full of damp and an income that made no sense. Gabriel, Duke of Aldern, was a tall, black-haired man in a dark riding coat, with a hard-boned face and grey eyes that gave away nothing at all. He was not the sort of new master a village hopes for. He was seen everywhere that first month, on horseback at 7 in the morning, and he asked questions, and the questions were good ones, and he did not smile at the answers. The word that came down the lane about him was cold, and clever, and fair, in that order, with the fairness sounding rather like an afterthought. He rode past the dye house on a bright morning at the end of that first month at a walk, and he looked in through the open door as he passed, because the door was open and there was steam coming out of it, and he looked at everything. What he saw was a woman in a canvas apron, lifting a hank of wool out of a copper on a long stick, holding it up into the light, and turning it slowly with her whole attention on it, in the way a jeweler turns a stone. He did not stop. He was not a man who stopped for a picturesque cottage industry, and he had 6 other things to see before noon. It would be a year and more before he thought about that morning again, and when he did he would find that he had remembered it perfectly, and that it had cost him nothing at the time to ride on. Roland Vesey came down from Marchbury in April in a gig with yellow wheels, and he came 3 times before he asked for anything, which is how a careful man does it. He was a broad, high-coloured man in a bottle-green coat and a great many rings, with a warm laugh and cold, busy eyes, and he was very good company. That should be said plainly, because it explains the whole village. He remembered names. He asked after Mrs. Bligh's hip. He stood in the dye-house doorway with his hat off, and said that the smell of a working copper was the smell of England's money, and Tobias Prine, who had disliked every clothier he had ever met, laughed until he had to sit down on the fulling stocks. On the 3rd visit he walked the length of the south wall with his hands behind his back, looking at the cards, and Hester watched him look. He went slowly. He stopped at the older rows where the wax seals had gone dark and brittle, and he read the writing on them, and then he counted, moving his chin very slightly, along one row and then down the columns. 400 and some, he said. 411. And the little sealed flap. That is, and he touched one with a fingernail, not quite hard enough to be a liberty. The same cloth, kept out of the light. The same cloth off the same piece, the same hour. So you can prove what a red of yours was, at any date. I can see what it was, she said. Proving is for lawyers. He laughed at that warmly and turned round and made his offer, and the offer was enormous. He wanted the receipt. Not the cloth, not the year's work, the method itself, outright in writing. With her hand to a paper, undertaking never to work the Scarlet again, he named a figure that would have kept her without labor for the rest of her life. He said it kindly, as a man does when he is certain, and he pointed out, correctly, that she had nobody to leave it to, and that a method locked in a cottage benefited nobody, whereas a method in the hands of a house with looms in 3 towns would clothe half the country. Hester Crail stood by her copper with the steam going up past her face, and thought about it for rather longer than the village would have believed. No, she said. He asked, still pleasantly, why? Because a receipt is not a thing you sell, she said. It is a thing you keep. My grandmother kept it 40 years and gave it me, and if I sell it, then in 10 years there is a Scarlet in the world with our work in it and our name off it. And the water it wants is at the bottom of that hill, and the men who own it will not know why it has stopped being any good. And they will make it worse and worse, and go on calling it by whatever name sells. I would rather it died with me. That would at least be honest. There was a silence of about 3 heartbeats, and in it his eyes changed. They did not become cruel, they became busy. He was a merchant, and she had just told him that the thing he wanted existed, was written down, and was in that room. You are a hard woman of business, Miss Crail, he said, laughing, putting his hat on. I shall ask again at my Kelmess. He did not ask again at my Kelmess. He did not need to. Edmund Sowerby came on the 2nd Tuesday of May with a printed order in his hand and a cart at the gate. He was a narrow, sandy man in rusty black, with a pen behind his ear and a ledger under his arm, and he had been steward of Halden Chase for 9 years, and had grown accustomed, under the old Duke, to being the only person who knew where anything was. The new Duke had ordered a full inventory of the estate. That part was true, and it matters, because half of what happened to Hester Crail happened inside a perfectly genuine piece of good administration. Aldern had come home to a muddle and set his steward to counting everything: the timber, the plate, the stock, the leases, the mills, every stick and stone the family owned. It gave Sowerby the run of the estate with a printed order in his hand and a reason to open any door in it. He wanted the book. Hester stood in the doorway of her own dye house and said no, and Sowerby, who did not raise his voice either, explained the position with the patience of a man reading out a tariff. The dye house was estate property. The coppers were estate property. The receipts of an estate manufactory were, in law, estate papers, whatever the custom of the place had been. The lease was yearly and at will. It would be renewed at Michaelmas as it always had been, of course. And here he looked at her over the ledger, mildly, for exactly as long as it took. A fortnight, he said. It will be copied into the inventory and returned to you. I shall give you a receipt for it. And he did give her a receipt for it, in his own small clerkly hand, on a leaf torn from his memorandum book received of Hester Crail, dyer, 1 book of dye receipts in calf, being estate papers, taken up for the inventory this second Tuesday in May, to be returned within 14 days. Sowerby, steward, he was proud of his method. He gave a receipt for everything. He entered everything. He had a page in the great inventory for every article on the estate, down to the fire irons in the North Lodge, and he wrote his entries the same day, because a thing not entered the same day is a thing lost. He was, in his way, as exact as she was. It is the only thing the two of them ever had in common, and it is what eventually hanged him. The book came back in 11 days, not 14, which she noted. It came back clean and undamaged, wrapped in the same sacking she had wrapped it in. She sat down with it that evening at the table under the window and went through it leaf by leaf, and she found nothing wrong at all for the first hour. Then she found the knots. Every snip of yarn in that book was tied through its slit with a reef knot, because Damaris Crale had been a sailor's widow and had tied a reef knot in everything she ever tied, and had cuffed Hester's fingers until Hester did the same. In 11 days somebody had untied and retied a great many of them, and had put back granny knots. Not all. Not carelessly. Just enough that whoever had done it had been holding the yarn up to a window, comparing it against something, and doing it one entry after another, for hours. Hester sat with the book open in the last of the light, and did not move for some time. Then she closed it, and put it back on the shelf above the drying rail, and wrote in that evening's entry, in her small upright hand, after the waits and the weather, book returned this day from the chase. Knots retied. Noted. She said nothing to anybody. There was nothing to say, and no one to say it to. 9 weeks later, at the great summer meeting in the Marchbury Cloth Hall, Roland Vesey announced to the drapers and staplers of 3 counties that after long and expensive labor, his house had perfected a scarlet of its own, a deep, fast scarlet, warranted against sun and rain, the property and secret of Vesey and Company, and he unrolled 8 yards of it down the table. And the room made the sound a room makes when it sees money. The first thing Hester lost was not her name. It was the wool. Halden Chase ran 900 sheep, and the whole of that clip had gone down the lane to Nether Halden every summer since before Damaris came there as a bride. In August, the steward laid before his master a schedule of proposed alterations in the estate contracts, 41 items on 9 sheets, each with a saving set against it in the right-hand column, and the 22nd item proposed that the clip be sold entire to Vesey and Company of Marchbury, who would take it raw at a better price than the village trade could pay for it. Gabriel, Duke of Aldern, read the schedule at his desk on a wet evening, and he read it properly, which is what makes it so much worse. He queried 4 items. He struck out 2. He asked whether the change would throw anybody out of work, and was told in the honest, faintly regretful voice that Sowerby had spent 9 years perfecting, that the Nether Halden people had had the clip on a favour for 2 generations, could not meet the price, and that there was no help for it in a bad year. The Duke signed the sheet. It took him perhaps 11 seconds. He was a tall, black-haired man in a dark riding coat, with a hard-boned face and grey eyes that gave away nothing at all, and it should be recorded that he was at that moment doing exactly what a conscientious landlord is supposed to do, and that a village of 11 working households went over a cliff on the strength of it. Then came the undercutting, and that was Vesey's part, and it was elegant. Halden's Scarlet had always been dear, because 11 days of mordanting and 3 days on the grass cannot be got for nothing. Marchbury Scarlet came out at a third under the price, and it looked, this must be admitted, because everything turns on it, exactly the same. In a shop, in the first month of its life, Vesey's cloth was Hester Crail's cloth. The same deep body, the same fire under the crimson, the same refusal to go orange in candlelight. A draper could hold the two side by side and see no difference whatsoever, and would then look at the two prices. By Martinmas her order book had 5 names in it. By Candlemas it had 2. Mrs. Bligh's loom stood quiet 3 days a week. Tobias Prime took work at the mill at Marchbury, and walked 7 miles each way to it. And then, in the spring, came the great order. The state-rooms at Halden Chase had not been touched in 30 years, and the Duke, having got the rest of his house into some order, turned to them. He wanted the 2 great chambers hung again, and the household in new livery, and he wanted it done for the ball he intended to give at Michaelmas, the evening on which he meant, though he would not have said so, to stop being the cold new man and become the master of the place. He said Scarlet, because the family had always used scarlet. He said it must be the best to be had, because he did not intend to be laughed at, and he did not say another word about it to anybody, because a duke does not buy cloth, a duke says scarlet, and a steward buys cloth. Sowerby bought it from Vesey, at Vesey's price. He entered it in the household ledger at Hester Crail's price, which was half again as much, under the heading it had been entered under in that ledger for 30 years, the Dye House, Nether Halden. The difference went into Edmund Sowerby's pocket, and it was not the first time, and that is all the mystery there ever was in it. He was not a devil. He was a tidy man with a small greedy habit and a great deal of authority, and the reason he had helped Vesey to the book in the first place was that Vesey had understood him within 10 minutes of meeting him, and had offered him a commission on every yard. Hester learned what had been ordered from Mrs. Bligh, who had it from her cousin in the still room, and who came down the lane in a state of considerable excitement because 40 yards of scarlet hangings meant the Chase was buying again. Hester went up to the Chase on the public day, when the county was let in to walk the terrace, and stood among the gentry in her plain slate blue gown, with her stained hands behind her, and looked in through the long windows at what was being hung in the state bedchamber. She knew inside 3 seconds. It was not the color. The color was hers, near enough. It was the surface. Crofted wool has a deep matte bloom, a way of eating the light and giving the color back from somewhere under itself, and cloth that has gone quickly from the mordant to the vat has a faint glare on the nap. And once you have spent your life looking at the difference, you cannot unsee it any more than a shepherd can unsee a limp. She stood there with the great sunlit room in front of her, and the swags of new red going up on their poles, and she understood, in order and without any particular emotion, 3 things: that her method was in that cloth, that whoever had made it had not crofted it, and that it would begin to go within the 12-month. Then a footman moved along the rope, and the crowd shifted, and she went home. She did not go to the Chase and demand to see the steward. She had no standing. She was a tenant at will on a yearly lease, and the man she would have complained to was the man who wrote the lease, and the man above him had signed away her whole trade in 11 seconds in August, without ever knowing her name. Nothing whatever would have come of it, and the one certain consequence would have been the lease. So she went home and dyed 30 pounds of homespun for a farmer's wife at Coldbrook, and made a card of it, and sealed the flap, and pinned it up. The hangings went up at Whitsun. It was a fine summer, and that was the whole of the tragedy, 17 weeks of high, clean, blazing weather. The sun came into the south front from 10 in the morning and lay along the state bedchamber wall all afternoon, and every afternoon it took a little more out of a red that had never been taught to hold. Nobody saw it happening, because nobody ever does. The turning of an unfast die is not an event, it is an average. You look at it on a Tuesday and it is red. You look at it in September and it is red. Then somebody moves a chair that has stood against the wall since May, and there behind it is a stripe of the true color, and everything on either side of the stripe is the color of weak tea. That was on the morning after the ball. The lease was not renewed. It came as a printed form with the blanks filled in, delivered by a man on a pony, and it gave her to the following quarter day to remove her goods from the premises, the estate having determined to put the building to other uses. Underneath, in the small clerkly hand, Sowerby had added a line of his own, and the line was the cruelest thing anybody did to her in the whole business, because it was not cruel at all, it was administrative. In view of the failure of the cloth lately supplied, the estate cannot continue the arrangement. She was allowed to take what was hers. What was hers was very little. The book, the brass seal, the shears, the small copper her grandmother had bought outright. 2 crocks of madder, the indigo, and the cards. The cards took her 4 days. She would not let Mrs. Bligh help, and she would not have them off the boards in handfuls. She took them down row by row from the roof beam end, keeping the order exactly as it had hung, and laid them in trays with a sheet of paper between every layer, oldest to newest, and wrote on the outside of each tray which years it held. 431 cards, 17 trays. On the last day she stood in the emptied dye house, with the light coming through the south window onto the bare boards, and where every card had hung there was a small, clean square of unweathered wood with 2 pinholes in it, so that the whole wall was a chart of the cards that were no longer on it. She looked at that for a while. Then she went out and shut the door and did not look at the lady well as she passed it, because the water was the one thing she could not put in a tray. She took 2 rooms in the end cottage from Mrs. Bligh, and set the small copper on the kitchen fire, and began again at the bottom. There was work, of a kind. There is always a woman in a village who wants a good black for a morning gown, or a blue for a petticoat, and Hester Crail would take a shilling for a job that had once left her door at £4 apiece, and did it as exactly as she had ever done anything. She got no more Scarlet. There was no crofting green, and no chalk water, and no money for madder. What she got instead, that winter, was the truth about how a village behaves. Some of it was bad. Women who had bought her reds for 15 years now crossed to the other side of the lane, not from malice, but from the ordinary human wish not to have to say anything. A man at the Marchbury market called out something about cheats and their prices when she went by, and got a laugh for it. The word went round and stuck, because a village would rather believe it had been cheated than believe it had been robbed and had helped. Some of it was not bad. Mrs. Bligh took no rent for the first quarter and would not discuss it. The vicar, an elderly and unexcitable man, made a point of walking the length of the lane with her on a market day where everyone could see, and Tobias Prine, coming back from his 7 miles, stopped at the gate every Saturday to tell her what was said at the mill about Marchbury Scarlet, and through all of it she did the thing that she is remembered for, and she began it within a month of losing everything. She went to the Marchbury market with money she could not spare, and bought a yard of VC's Marchbury Scarlet over the counter, like any customer, and paid for it and took the bill. She carried it home and cut 2 strips from it the width of 2 fingers, and pinned them side by side on a stiff card, and wrote the day on the card by its feast, and where the maker's name went she wrote Vesey and Co., Marchbury, bought publicly this day, bill kept. Then she folded the paper hood over the left-hand strip and sealed it down and set her grandmother's brass seal in the wax. Then she went up the lane to the church, and had the vicar write the day under her writing in his own hand, and initial it the way he did every Lady Day, and he did it without asking a single question, which she never forgot. She pinned that card in the window of Mrs. Bly's back kitchen, and beside it she pinned one of her own from her own trays, dyed within a month of Vessey's, so that the 2 reds hung together in the same glass with the same sun on them. And then she did it again at Candlemas, and at Lady Day, and at Whitsoon, and at Lammas, until there were 8 cards in that window in 2 rows, his and hers, all through the year. She also, in December, spent a shilling with a ragman in the Marchbury shambles on 3 yards of foxed brown and lilac wool that he had bought by the cartload out of a great house, and could not sell to anybody, and made a card of that too, and wrote on it what it was, and whose cart it had come out of. The ragman thought her mad, and told the story for a year, and it did her no good at all in the town. By the next Whitsun the window had begun to answer her. There was nothing dramatic in it. It was not the kind of thing you could have called anybody in to see. But if you took down the card she had made at Michaelmas, and broke the wax, and laid the sealed strip against the bare one, hers came apart at the join, and you could not find it. And if you broke the wax on his card of the same month, the sealed strip came out of the dark the color of a hot coal, and the strip that had stood 8 months in the window beside it was half a tone light, and a little cooler, and going very quietly, the way a fire goes when nobody has put anything on it. Hester Crail laid the 2 of them on the sill, and looked at them for a long moment, and then she wrote the observation in the book, in her small upright hand, with the day and the weather, as though it were a batch like any other. She did not go to anybody with it. There was nobody to go to who would have looked. She simply pinned it back up, and let the sun go on working, because the sun was the only witness she had who could not be sent away from the door, and she knew exactly how long it needed. What undid Roland Vesey in the end was not a clever woman. It was arithmetic, and it was done by a man who had spent a year being quietly ashamed of himself and did not yet know it. The Duke had put the staterooms out of his mind, in the way that men put a humiliation out of their minds, which is to say he thought about it 4 times a day. The chambers stood empty with their poles bare. He had not reordered. He told himself it was economy. Then, in the space of 1 week in February, 3 letters came. The first was from a neighbor whose carriage linings had gone the color of a bad complexion, asking half apologetically whether the Duke knew of a good house. The second was from the Lord Lieutenant, who did not apologize at all, and who wanted to know what had happened to the county's Scarlet, because his servants looked as though they had been dipped in tea. The third was from a man Aldern had been at Cambridge with, whose new coat had faded across the shoulders in a single winter, and who mentioned the maker's name as one mentions a joke. The name in all 3 letters was Vesey and Company of Marchbury. Aldern read them at his desk, one after another, and then he sat back and did a very simple sum, and the sum went off in his head like a gun. Every one of those cloths had been made and sold within the past 12 months. The Nether Halden dye house had been shut and emptied for a full year. Whatever was rotting the Scarlet of 3 counties had gone on being made after the woman he had blamed for it had been put out of her building. He sat for a while with his hands flat on the desk. Then he rang and asked for the household ledger and turned to the account of the staterooms and found the entry in Sowerby's small, clerkly hand, to the dye house. Nether Halden, 42 yards scarlet hanging cloth, and 130 yards livery cloth, with a sum against it. He asked for the vouchers. It took 2 days to produce them, which he also noticed, and when they came, the voucher for that entry was an invoice from Vesey and Company of Marchbury for the same cloth, in a sum that was £211 less. Sowerby explained it, standing up, holding his ledger, mildly, and the explanation was not bad. The dye house had been unable to supply. The goods had been got in through Marchbury as an accommodation. The entry stood under the old heading, because the account had always stood under the old heading, and the difference was carriage and finishing, and the ordinary charges of the trade. £211 of carriage, the Duke said. Over 8 months, Your Grace. Fetch me the dye house book. Sowerby's face did nothing at all. That was his mistake. A man surprised by a question looks surprised. There is no such article in the inventory. There is a manufactory on my land that has been making cloth for 2 generations, and there is no book of receipts. The woman worked by guess, Your Grace, as they do. That was rather the trouble with it. The Duke let him go, and went upstairs. He was looking for something quite innocent. He wanted to see what the state bedchamber had looked like before, because he had a plan of refitting it in green, and wished to know how the old red had sat against the paneling, and the old hangings had been taken down and stored in his uncle's time and never thrown away, because nothing at Halden Chase had ever been thrown away. They were in the storeroom over the chapel, in a cedar chest under 3 moth-eaten counterpanes and a bundle of stair carpet. He got them out himself, coat off, in the dust and the cold, and carried an armful to the window at the end of the passage where the winter light came in white and hard, and shook out the first fold. It was scarlet. Not the memory of scarlet. Not a color that had once been scarlet and was now being politely described. It was the deep, fired, matte, undeniable red of the thing he had ordered and not been given, and it had hung on those walls for a lifetime, and lain folded in a cedar box in a cold roof for 30 years since, and where the sun had got at it in its hanging days it had gone, at the very most, half a tone softer than the rest. He turned it over in his hands for a long time. Underneath it in the chest was a woman's cloak, scarlet, lined and hooded, with a good deal of wear at the wrists. He knew it before he had it out of the chest. His mother had worn that cloak on every cold morning of his life, and had been buried in her grey, and somebody had folded this away with the hangings, and forgotten it, and it had been in a cedar box in the dark for 11 years, and it was the same red as the day she had it made. He carried the cloak down to the terrace, where a bundle of the ruined hanging still lay by the door, because nobody had known what to do with it, and he knelt on the flags in the February cold in his shirt sleeves, and laid the two together in the daylight. Sewn inside the collar of the cloak, on a strip of linen tape, in a cramped and furious hand, was the word Crail, and under it, Nether Haldan. Gabriel, Duke of Aldern, knelt there for rather a long time. He had signed a schedule in 11 seconds. He had said 9 words on a terrace on the morning after his ball and gone in to breakfast. He had never once, in the whole of that year, asked the only question that mattered, which was, who makes the red that lasts? And he had not asked it because the person who could answer it was a woman in an apron with dirty hands whom he had ridden past and not stopped for. He stood up and gave the cloak to the housekeeper to be brushed and hung, and told her to have the ruined stuff kept and not burned, and sent for his horse. He rode down the lane to Nether Haldan by himself, at 4 in the afternoon, and had to ask a woman at a gate which cottage it was. Mrs. Bly opened the door to a duke, and went the colour of a dishcloth, and could not get out of the way of her own doorstep, and there was a bad half-minute in the passage before Hester came through from the back kitchen, drying her forearms on a rag. She was a spare, straight-backed woman in a plain slate-blue gown and a dyer's canvas apron, her fair hair pinned flat beneath a linen cap, and her hands stained red to the wrist, and she looked at him with no more and no less attention than she would have given a carrier at the gate. Your Grace. Miss Crail. He took his hat off. I have come to ask you a question I ought to have asked a year ago. Did you dye the cloth that was hung in my state bedchamber? No. You are certain? Yes. He waited for the rest of it. He had been braced the whole way down the lane for the tears, or the flood of grievance, or the terrible, careful politeness of somebody who has rehearsed a speech to a great man for a year. He had a face he wore for that. There was no rest of it. She stood in the passage with the rag in her hand and waited for his next question, and it went on being quiet for long enough that he understood she was not going to fill the silence for him, and something in the back of his mind sat up. How can you be certain? You never saw it made. I saw it hung, on the public day, from the terrace, at about 12 yards. And it had a shine on it. She said it exactly as she would have said it to another dyer. Wool that has lain out on the grass 3 days between the mordant and the vat takes the colour into itself, and the surface goes dead and deep, and you can see it across a room. Wool that is hurried takes the colour onto itself, and there is a glare on the nap in a strong light. It is the difference between a colour and a coat of paint, and it cannot be got any other way but by the 3 days, and you can tell that at 12 yards. I have been looking at it since before I could read, Your Grace. He turned his hat over once in his hands. Then somebody made that cloth by your method and left out the part that takes the time. Yes. Can you prove it? No, said Hester Crail. I cannot prove anything to a man who has decided. But the cloth can. It has been proving it for a year, and it will have finished by summer, and it does not care what anybody says to it. She stood aside from the door of the back kitchen. You may look if you like. It is only a window. It was only a window. It was the back kitchen window of a weaver's cottage, 4 small panes over 4, with a deal table under it and a copper on the fire, and the whole room smelling of ammonia and wet wool, and pinned along the glazing bars in 2 neat rows were 8 stiff cards. Bought at Marchbury Market. Over the counter, like anybody, she said. Every quarter day. That is his. This is mine, of the same month, out of my own trays. Both of them have stood in that window since the day they were pinned there, in the same light, the same hours. She took down the topmost card of his and set it on the table and broke the wax with her thumbnail and unfolded the paper hood, and the strip that came out of the dark was a hot, deep, splendid scarlet, and it was, without any argument, a beautiful piece of dyeing. The strip pinned beside it, off the same yard, cut the same minute, was not that color any more. It had not gone brown, it had gone thin. The fire had come out from underneath it and left a flat, cool red like watered wine, and along the top edge, where the sun struck first in the morning, there was a bloom of pinkish gray, and once the eye had found the difference, the eye could not stop finding it. Then she took down her own card of that month and broke that wax and laid the two strips together, and the Duke bent over the table and could not tell where the sealed half ended and the sun struck half began. He turned the card to the light. He turned it again. He put his thumb across the join and moved it, to be sure he had not been shown a trick. "This is a year," he said. 14 months. That one is 8. She set another pair down beside it, and these are the quarter before, and they go the same way and rather faster, because he is making it in bigger lots now, and I should say his mordant has been cut, and this, and she laid down a card with a brown and lilac scrap pinned to it, is 3 yards of your bedchamber, your grace, which I bought off a ragman in the shambles for a shilling. That is where they are all going. Aldern stood in a weaver's back kitchen in his riding coat, with the winter light coming through the panes onto 8 cards and a shilling's worth of his own ruin, and understood that he had been living for a year inside a piece of natural philosophy that this woman had been conducting in a window, alone with no money, while the county threw stones at her. "Why did you not come to me? Because you would not have seen me," she said without any edge at all, as a matter of fact, "and because it was not finished. A dye takes the time it takes. I could have come to you in the spring with 2 cards, and you would have said the light was different, or the wool was different, or the woman was bitter, and you would have been perfectly entitled to. There is only one answer to that, and it is more cards and more months." She squared the row with 2 fingers. "It is finished now." He asked her then what she wanted, and he asked it in the way great men do ask it, meaning money, meaning the lease, meaning a settlement that would make the thing go away and let him sleep. "I want it said out loud in the place it was said wrong," said Hester Crail. "It was said in the cloth hall at Marchbury. I should like it unsaid there." "That is all? That is all I can be given, your grace. The rest I can make for myself, if you will let me have the water." He looked at her for a moment. "Your grandmother's book," he said. "Did it exist? It is on the shelf behind you." And Gabriel, Duke of Aldern, who had been told 2 days before by his own steward that there had never been any book, turned round very slowly and looked at it. He read the book at Mrs. Bligh's kitchen table until it was too dark to see, with a tallow candle at his elbow and his horse tied to the gate for 2 hours in the cold. He was not a sentimental man and did not pretend to understand a quarter of it, but he had spent 6 years abroad looking at manufactories, and he knew what he was holding. 40 years of dated entries in 2 hands, every one with a snip of the actual yarn tied through the margin, You can forge a page, you cannot forge a habit. He came to the burnt leaf at the front and stopped. What was here? The galls. How much? 9 ounces to the 100 weight of wool, said Hester, and it wants to be 9 and not 8 and not 10. My grandmother told it me over the vat more times than I could count. There was no room to write it back on a burnt corner, and I never saw a reason. The Duke sat with his hand flat on the page for a moment. Miss Crail, he said, if a man copied this book in 11 days at my house, every weight, every bath, every day of the 11, what would he have for the galls? And Hester Crail, who had lived with that hole in the page for so long that she had stopped seeing it, sat down slowly on the other side of the table. He would have nothing, she said. He would have to choose a number. Yes, said the Duke, and he would have to choose the same number every time afterwards, because it is his receipt now and he must keep it, and every yard he has ever sold would have that number in it. Mr. Otway, an apothecary of Marchbury with a small private mania for the analysis of dye-stuffs, was brought out to Nether Halden 3 days later, and given a strip of each and left alone with them for a week, and what he came back with was better than anybody had hoped. Both cloths, he said, had been mordanted in the same peculiar order, the galls after the alum and not before, an inversion no dyer of his acquaintance would commit, which left an unmistakable warm brown cast in the undyed cotton of the selvage and the sewing thread. Both carried a trace of tin in the same very small proportion, which was itself unusual. In every qualitative particular the two mordants were, in his phrase, of one family. They differed in exactly one thing. The Marchbury cloth carried barely 1/3 of the gall of the Nether Halden cloth. 3 ounces to the 100 weight where hers had 9. 3, Otway observed dryly, is not a number a man arrives at by accident. It is a number a man arrives at by guessing low, to save the cost of the galls, and then never daring to move. And 3 ounces of gall, he added, would leave the alum insufficiently fixed in the fibre, which, with no crofting on the grass to make up the want, was as neat an explanation of a red that failed in 14 months as he had ever had the pleasure of writing out. After that it was only a matter of paper, and the paper had all been kept by the man it hanged. Hester still had the leaf out of Sowerby's memorandum book, folded into the front of the calf volume where she put everything, received of Hester Crail, dyer, 1 book of dye receipts in calf, taken up for the inventory this 2nd Tuesday in May, and at the Chase, in the great inventory that had been the whole justification of the thing, in the steward's own hand, stood the entry he had made the same day, No. 704. 1 book of dye receipts, calf, of the dye house at Nether Halden. Taken up for copying. Returned. Taken up for copying. He had written it himself, 9 weeks before Roland Vesey stood up in the Marchbury Cloth Hall and told 3 counties about the long and expensive labour of his own house. The parish chest was opened on a Thursday morning in the vestry, with the vicar and both churchwardens present, and the Duke standing at the end of the table with his hat under his arm. The sealed packets came out in a row, 1 for every Lady Day, the wax dark and the parish arms still crisp in it, the oldest written in a cramped and furious hand that had been under the churchyard grass for years. Inside each was a card, and on each card a scarlet that was still a scarlet, and under Hester's writing, the vicar's writing, and 2 churchwardens' initials. The senior warden, a farmer of 70 who had never had a good word for anybody, held one up to the vestry window and said, into a completely silent room, that his own father had put his name to that one. Vesey was told within the day, because a village is a village. He did not run, and he did not offer money to the Duke, and he did not make any of the mistakes a lesser man would have made. He did something far more dangerous. He attacked. His letter to Aldern was a masterpiece. He was distressed beyond measure that his grace should have been imposed upon. The unhappy woman at Nether Holden had been in his employ for years, and had had the run of his own works at Marchbury. The receipt was his house's, come down to him from his predecessors. Her book was a spiteful fabrication got up since her disgrace. There being no difficulty whatever in writing an old date on a new page, and country clergymen were sometimes imposed upon by parishioners of long acquaintance. And behind the letter stood the trade. That was the part Aldern had not reckoned on. Half the drapers of 3 counties were sitting on Marchbury Scarlet at cost. If Vesey was a thief, their stock was rubbish, and every yard of it would come back over their counters within 2 years. They did not want it to be true, and they were not villains, and that made them far worse. So it could not be settled by a duke's word, and Aldern, riding home in a black temper, worked out that this was probably just as well. Hester said the same thing when he told her, in the same flat voice, standing at her copper. Then it must be the cloth that says it, she said. It was always going to have to be the cloth. My word is nothing, and yours is only rank. Set it in front of men who buy for a living, and let them handle it. A demand went to the wardens of the Marchbury Cloth Hall for a hearing at the summer meeting. In open hall, all parties present. The cloth to be tried before the trade. Vesey accepted by return graciously, and he meant it, because he had counted what was against him, a ruined countrywoman, a book he could call a forgery, and a duke with a grievance about his curtains, and had concluded that he would win. A week before the meeting, a man neither of them knew came to the end cottage and offered Hester Crail £400 for her trays of cards, on behalf of a collector of curiosities. She gave him back his hat and shut the door, and went and moved the trays that night, in the dark, on a hand-cart, to the vestry, where the parish chest was, and where the vicar sat up with a lamp. The Marchbury Cloth Hall on the morning of the summer meeting held something over 200 men and a great deal of noise, and when Hester Crail came in at the low end with a hand-cart and the vicar walking beside her, the noise did not stop. It went on talking about her for a full 10 minutes, with her standing there in her plain slate-blue gown and her dyer's canvas apron, her fair hair pinned flat beneath a linen cap, and her hands stained red to the wrist. The wardens of the hall presided, 3 of them at the long table. The Duke sat where any other witness sat, on a bench at the side, and had made a particular point of it. Vesey spoke first, and he was superb. He rose at the end of the warden's table, a broad, high-coloured man in a bottle-green coat and a great many rings, with a warm laugh and cold, busy eyes, and the hall was pleased to see him get up. He was gracious to her. That was the clever part. He would not have it said that he had ruined a poor woman. The poor woman had lost her trade to a better and cheaper article, as honest tradesmen do every year, and it was natural she should have persuaded herself of a wrong. He grieved for her. He produced his house's receipt book. And 2 men, to swear the Scarlet, had been talked of at Marchbury for a great while. He observed with regret that a date can be written on anything, and the hall laughed with him, and the laugh went through Hester like cold water. Then she was asked to speak, and she spoke badly. She was not an orator, and had never in her life addressed more than 4 people. She said the method was her grandmother's. She said the book was true. She heard her own voice going flat and small under the roof, and she heard a man at the back say something that got an answer, and she stopped in the middle of a sentence. Then she said, "I am no good at this. May I have the long table and the window?" The wardens let her have it, mostly out of curiosity. She had the trays brought in and laid the cards out down the length of the hall, in order, oldest first, and it took 20 minutes, and nobody left. 431 cards. When they were all down, the row ran the whole length of the boards and turned the corner, and men who had been laughing walked along beside it, with their hands behind their backs, the way men walk along a horse. Then the parish packets were opened by the wardens themselves, one at a time, wax broken in front of the room, and the senior warden of the hall, who was not the kind of man to be imposed upon by a country clergyman, read out the names on each, and stopped at the 4th, and said that he had known the hand of the man who signed it, and had bought wool off him for 30 years. Then she broke the seals. She did it quarter by quarter, at the window, in front of everybody, her card and his card of the same month, the sealed half and the sun struck half, laid together on white paper. Hers came out of the dark and matched the light. His came out of the dark and did not, and did not, and did not, 8 times, and each time the difference was a little worse, and by the 6th the hall had gone properly quiet at last, and men were pushing to see. Then Otway did the boil, because a merchant will believe a kettle. A piece of each cloth, the same weight, into 2 pans of boiling soap liquor over a spirit lamp on the warden's table. Hers went round and round in water that stayed grey. His bled. It bled in a soft rose cloud within 90 seconds, and the water went the colour of a wound, and 200 men who had spent their lives handling cloth watched a third of a county's stock lose its warranty in a pan. Then the unpicking. Otway had a strip of each selvage drawn out, and the cotton sewing thread lifted with a needle and laid on white card, and both threads carried the same warm brown cast that comes only from taking the galls after the alum instead of before, an inversion, he said, that no dyer in England commits, and which he had never met with in 20 years of assay, except in these 2 cloths. In every particular of the mordant, he said, the 2 were of one family, and then the wardens asked Roland Vesey to state the particulars of his house's receipt. He had to. There was no way out of it that did not look like the end. He stood up and stated them, and he stated them well, and every one of them was Damaris Crales, the bran and stale ale, the alum in hard water and never in soft, the galls at the second bath, the spoonful of the grey liquor, the 11 days. He did not say 3 days on the grass, because it was not in the book he had copied. It was in the practice, and the practice had not been in the room. And at the end the senior warden said, "The galls." "What weight?" 3 ounces to the hundredweight, said Vesey. 9, said Hester Crale. She had the calf book open in her hands already, at the front, at the master receipt, and she carried it up and laid it on the warden's table and turned it round so that it faced them. and put one finger beside the burnt corner where the fire had eaten the weight of galls out of the page, leaving a brown scalloped hole with the ash edge still on it. For a moment, looking down at the hole in the page, she could see the woman who had made it. A small, bent woman in a russet gown and a scorched apron, her forearms mottled madder red to the elbow, saying the number into the steam for the 200th time and not troubling to write it back in. "That was burnt before I was old enough to reach the vat," she said. "The number was never written back in. My grandmother told it me over the copper 200 times. 9 ounces, and it wants to be 9 and not 8 and not 10, and a man who has the whole of this page except that corner has to choose a number for himself." She looked at Vesey then, for the only time all morning. "You chose low, sir, because galls cost money. You have been putting 3 in for 2 years. That is why it lets go. It is not a fault in the trade. It is the hole in my grandmother's page." Otway said, into the noise, that he had measured the gall in 9 separate pieces of Marchbury Scarlet, bought in 4 towns, and it was 3 ounces in every one of them, and that a house which had invented a process over long and expensive labor does not settle on the one quantity that destroys it. And the Duke of Aldern stood up from the bench at the side and read out 2 lines. The first was from a leaf torn out of a memorandum book received of Hester Crail, dyer, 1 book of dye receipts in calf, taken up for the inventory this 2nd Tuesday in May. The second was from his own estate inventory, in the same hand, on the same day. No. 704. 1 book of dye receipts, calf, of the dye house at Nether Halden, taken up for copying. 9 weeks, he said, before this hall was told of a secret perfected at Marchbury. Edmund Sowerby was sitting 4 rows back. He was a narrow, sandy man in rusty black, with a pen behind his ear and a ledger under his arm. And when his own entry was read out in his own words, he did not stand, and he did not speak. He simply looked at the ledger under his arm, which had been the whole of his life, and understood that he had written it all down himself, the same day, because a thing not entered the same day is a thing lost. He was taken up that afternoon at the sign of the bell. The wardens withdrew for less than half an hour. They came back and struck the hall's mark from every bale of Vesey and Company Scarlet in the town, and entered a minute in the hall book that the Scarlet known as Marchbury Scarlet was the property in method of the dye house at Nether Halden, that the said Roland Vesey had obtained it by copying, and that the failure of the said cloth arose from the copy, and from no fault in the original. The senior warden read the minute aloud, standing, in the place where the thing had been said wrong, which is all Hester Crail had asked for. She was asked afterwards, by a great many people who had crossed the lane to avoid her, whether she had anything to say. "Only that I did not do it," she said, "and that I have been saying so for 2 years in the only language I have." Then she began, quite methodically, to put 431 cards back into their trays in the right order, and after a moment the vicar started at the far end, and then the senior warden of the Marchbury Cloth Hall took off his coat and started in the middle. Vesey and Company did not survive the winter. The stock came back over the counters faster than the wardens had predicted, because once a trade has seen a pan of water go the color of a wound, it does not need telling twice. And a house that cannot warrant its own scarlet cannot warrant anything. Roland Vesey went to a cousin in Antwerp, and was not heard of again in 3 counties, and the fine new counting house with his name on the door was let to a corn factor within the year. Edmund Sowerby was committed to the assizes for the £211, which was a smaller crime than the other one, and the only one the law had a shelf for. He was a tidy man to the end. He had entered the sums himself. The Duke came down the lane on a wet morning in October with a paper in his coat and offered Hester Crail a great deal of money. She would not have it. What she wanted she had thought about for a year, and she gave it to him in one sentence: the Dye House, the Crofting Green, and the Lady Well, on a lease of her life and 40 years after it, at a rent set down in figures, to descend to whomever she should train, and not at the will of any steward living. That is a worse bargain for you than the money, he said. It is a better one for the Red, said Hester Crail. He gave her the lease and the estate's whole clip with it, and had the coppers put back and a new one bought, and never afterwards pretended that any of it was generosity. It took the best part of a year to hang the state bedchamber, because 11 days is 11 days, and 3 days on the grass are 3 days on the grass, and there is no arrangement between a duke and a dyer that can shorten them. He learned the stages. He came down and stood in the doorway in his dark riding coat, and asked questions of the kind that show a man has been thinking since the last time, and she answered them fully, in a flat voice, the way she would have answered another dyer. And it is possible that neither of them noticed for some months how much of his week those afternoons had come to take up. He brought the cloak down and put it on the table and asked whether it could be matched. She turned it over and found the tape at the collar with her grandmother's cramped and furious hand on it, and stood with her thumb on the word for a moment. It can be equaled, she said. It cannot be bettered. She was better at it than I am. I have seen no evidence of that. You have seen 431 cards, Your Grace. Half of them are hers. The lane came back to life the way such places do, unevenly and with a good deal of complaining. Mrs. Bligh's loom went 6 days a week. Tobias Prine came home off the Marchbury Road and fulled cloth again, and was insufferable about having always known. Halden Scarlet went out of the county at a price that made the drapers of 3 counties sigh, and it was bought, because it is cheaper in the end to buy a red that stays. On the day the new hangings went up, the Duke stood in the state bedchamber, with the sun coming in from the south front, and looked at 42 yards of it burning quietly on the wall, and then he went down the lane, and found her at the copper, and did what he had wanted to do for a considerable time, which was to take her hand. She looked at it, stained crimson to the wrist, as it always was and always would be, in his. "It does not come off," she said. "I am aware of it," said Gabriel, Duke of Aldern. "It is the only part of this house I have entirely learned to trust. There is not a great deal more. They were married in the spring, in the church where the parish chest stood, and the vicar who had written the day under her writing every Lady Day of her working life, read the service and enjoyed himself very much, and the county said what a county says, and got over it within 2 seasons. She never gave up the dye house, and she never gave up the cards. The last thing she did on the day the state bedchamber was finished was walk back down the lane in the dusk, with 2 strips cut from the end of that piece, and pin them on a stiff card, and write the day on it in her small upright hand, and fold the paper hood over the left-hand one, and seal it with her grandmother's brass seal. Then she pinned it on the boards under the south window, in its place at the end of the long rows, and opened the shutter so the sun could get at it in the morning. You need not shout. You need only keep the card, and let the year go by, and the cloth will keep its own account.